a glass of water. So I have a glass of water here, and you all thought it was because I was thirsty, but that's our object lesson for today. And as we begin our subject today, we're going to start with a story. I'm going to start by sharing you a story. We're going to begin a bit of a journey. So this journey begins in the town of Torino in northern Italy. So I caught the train up to Torino. Am I messing up your camera really bad? Okay. I get claustrophobic if I have to stand in one place. Okay, so Torino. I'm in Torino. I get off the train. I rent a car. I'm on a journey. I immediately get lost, horribly lost. I ask directions from an Italian guy. He speaks no English. I speak no Italian, but we communicate, and he says, "Follow me." So I follow him. And he actually leads me all the way out of the city, points me in the right direction, and then goes back, which is just incredible. And so as you leave Torino, you're heading out over these flat plains, very, very fertile country, lots of produce being grown everywhere. And you can sort of see in the background there the mountains. And as you get closer to those mountains, they really stand up. They're spectacular. They are absolutely amazing. And then you reach the mountains, and the highway starts to go up into the mountains. Now, these are the mountains of the Waldensian valleys. You are probably familiar with the Waldensian valleys. I was heading for a place called La Basiglia, or the Basilica. And you might be wondering, why was I heading there? Well, you head up into the mountains and it just gets higher and the roads get narrower, and you sort of wonder, how did they manage to actually carve these roads out of the mountains that you are driving through? There are places there where, there is well, you kind of wonder where the path used to go before they made the tunnel. How did they actually get up here into this very, very high village? This road is only one lane wide. I had a little Fiat, as you do when you're in Italy. Had a little Fiat, and I was very worried that someone would come the other direction, because I'm thinking there's not room here for two cars to pass side by side. And of course, down below you, you've got that. And up above you, you've got cliffs, and you're just going up, up, up. Every kilometer that you go, you are getting higher into the mountains until you come to the end of the road, and there's a village. And you kind of wonder, how is that village there? I had to cut through the snow to get into the village. And that's it. That's the end of the road. From there on, it is just mountains. You keep going over those mountains, you will hit France. But that is the end of the road. And La Basiglia lies at the end of the road. And there's a very interesting story in relationship to this little town right here, the town of La Basiglia. And by the way, this mountain that is, you can see the village here in the foreground, and that building with the red on it, that's the museum, very small museum there. Wasn't open the day I was there, unfortunately. But that mountain there in the background of the village, that's the Basilica right there. That's the place they call the Basilica. So there's a little bit of history a little bit of story I need to share with you in relationship to this. You see, the Waldensians were bitterly persecuted for their faith. They believed in the Bible and the Bible alone. They believed in salvation by grace alone. And as a result of that, they found themselves being persecuted by the Church of Rome. And they faced 800 years of continual persecution. 800 years of continual persecution, and survived it. And you might wonder why and how. When you visit the valleys, you can see to a certain degree how they were able to survive, because these valleys are simply the greatest natural fortress that has ever been built. It's almost like God just, purposely said, okay, how can I build a fortress, an impenetrable fortress here? And the papists of the time estimated that it would take them 100 soldiers to take the life of one Waldensian peasant. That was the averages. Those were the odds in those days. And of course, they were able to survive there. And they survived there up until the year 1655. And so there'd been 800 years of continual crusades up until the year 1655. And at this particular point, the Vatican decided, we can't win this war. And by the way, this is a small area, about the size of the Wadigans, probably smaller. It's not a big area. And you think 800 years of crusades and they couldn't take it? It's absolutely miraculous. So the papists decide, well, we can't win this. We just can't. It's impossible. We can't root these people out of here. So let's do something different. And so they came to the Waldensians and they said, let's make peace. And the Waldensians was like, yeah, absolutely. That's great. We want peace. And the papists said, one of the big barriers to peace is that we don't really know each other. The people down on the plains who are Roman Catholics, they kind of think that you guys have, horns and hoofs and 3 heads and that kind of stuff. You know how it is when there's a culture that you're unfamiliar with and it's on the other side of the world and you hear about it and you think, well, that's a really nasty place. I don't want to have anything to do with that culture. And then when you meet somebody from that culture, they move in next door and you find out they're just a person like you and they're actually pretty awesome. And so the paper said, let's do this. Why don't we get to know you guys? We'll come up into the valleys. We'll stay in your homes and we can get to know each other and this will be a great way of producing peace. And the Waldensians said, yeah, what a great idea. That's kind of what we've always wanted to do. We would love to share our hospitality with you. Come and join us. And so the papists went up there into the valleys and they billeted themselves in their homes. And that night at midnight, somebody rang a bell and the papists all woke up and killed everybody, man, woman, and child. Out of a population of 23,000, there was around about 4,000 that survived because they were already in jail. In the valleys themselves, there were small pockets of individuals that had survived the massacre that actually managed to find each other over time. They numbered about 80 and they became known as the Unconquerables. Because what they did was they took the battle back to the papists, because the papists were like, okay, we've wiped them all out. We'll resettle these valleys with Roman Catholics. And so they brought all of these people in to resettle the area. And these 80 people would harass them and drive them out and push them back. They were too small. They couldn't hold any land. But they made it impossible for anyone to live in the valleys. And after a certain amount of time of this, and I mean, these guys, they were just living in the mountains, and you can see those mountains right there. That would be an inhospitable place to live. But they'd grown up there. That's what they were used to. Anyway, eventually the papists decided that this wasn't working either. And so they came to them and they said, okay, all right, here's what we will do. If you leave, as in if you just leave, we will take everyone that we still have in prison and we will let them out of prison so long as you can take them with you. The Waldensians decided that was the best deal that they were ever going to get. Switzerland put up their hand and Switzerland was like, yes, please, please, come here to Switzerland. We would love to have you. And so then the papists waited until it was the middle of winter, let everybody out of the prisons. And as they marched over the mountains to get to Switzerland, one died for every mile. I mean, you think about walking through those mountains in the middle of winter like that. 2 years later, so let's give a little bit of historical background here for those of you who love dates. So it was 1687 by the time they were able to go to Switzerland. It was 1689, a couple of years later, that a Waldensian commando was formed for the purpose of going from Switzerland back to the valleys and retaking the valleys. They believed that they could do so. They had the home ground advantage. They knew the terrain very well, and they knew they could fight an asymmetric war there very effectively. They'd done it for 800 years, and they're like, why are we living in exile? Why are we in Switzerland? Our valleys are right there. And so they marched back and they fought all summer long, and they were very successful. But once again, they were just too small to hold the towns. They could conquer the towns, they just couldn't hold them. And then as the winter began to set in, the 300 that were left decided, we need to find a safe place to go where we can bed down for the winter. We don't want to be living in the open during winter. And so one of the men was there who was there. He'd grown up in this little town of La Basiglia. And he says, I know just the place is at the end of the road. They will never find us. It is so unbelievably remote. And so they went to La Basiglia, to bed down for the winter, and to stay in the homes right there, these stone-built homes. Well, the papists found out where they were and sent 4,000 men to take that town. And so when the papists arrived, the Waldenses actually retreated to the top of this mountain right here. They retreated out of the village to the top of the mountain, and the papists laid siege to it. Here's a few more photos of this little town with a river running through the middle of it. And you can see my little blue Fiat right there. And this is looking down from the mountain. You're sort of looking down on top of the village. This was part of the mountain that they went up. I didn't climb all the way to the top. I didn't have time to climb all the way to the top, but it gets really steep going up. You kind of get a bit of an impression of just how steep it is when you look at, and photos really flatten everything out. But you're faced with places like this where it's going to be really hard to launch an assault up this mountainside. And so the Waldenses were camped on the top, and the papists launched assault after assault after assault up this mountainside and were unable to take it. The Waldenses did not suffer a single casualty, not one. And the papists were just getting wiped out every time they tried to assault it. And so they said, okay, we can't actually physically get up there. So they were so determined to root out these 300 men that they decided to bring artillery in and to blast them off the top of the mountain. It took them 6 weeks. I mean, you saw the road that I drove up. Imagine back when that was a track and you got to drag cannons up there. It took them 6 weeks to get cannons up there. And eventually they were able to get their cannons up, get their cannons in place, and start ranging their cannons in. They spent a day ranging the cannons in. And at the end of that day, they had them ranged in, and they knew that the next day they could just blast them off the top of the mountain.